Flames licked at the night sky, the acrid smell of burning rubber filling Karen's nostrils. Her prized Harley, a chrome and leather beast she poured her savings into, was engulfed, the orange glow reflecting in her wide, horrified eyes. A lump of rage formed in her throat, choking her. Someone had torched her bike. Right there, in her own driveway. She scanned the dimly lit street, her neighbor's houses dark, curtains tightly drawn. Her gaze snagged on a figure across the street, shrouded in shadow, but unmistakably watching. Their face, a pale blur in the darkness, was twisted into a smug smirk. It was Mrs. Henderson, the old battle axe next door who'd been complaining about Karen's eyesore motorcycle ever since she'd moved in 6 months ago. Fury, hot and consuming, pulsed through Karen's veins. This wasn't just about the bike anymore. This was a personal attack, a violation. Mrs. Henderson had crossed a line Karen didn't even realize existed until this moment. But she knew one thing: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As sirens wailed in the distance, Karen stalked towards her front door, her jaw set in a grim line. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking with suppressed rage. The first number she dialed wasn't 911. It was the non-emergency line for the local police station. She might be on medical leave, still recovering from that nasty shootout, but she was a state trooper, damn it, and this was her own personal arson investigation. Sergeant Miller, it's Karen Thompson. Yeah, I need to report an incident. And you might want to send someone over to Mrs. Henderson's place down the street too. The sirens were getting closer, the flashing lights reflecting in Karen's cold, determined eyes. It seems my neighbor has a little bonfire going, and I think she might need help putting it out. The line clicked dead, but the fire in Karen's eyes was just igniting. This wasn't about following HOA rules anymore. This was about justice. And Karen Thompson always got her due. The fire crew extinguished the flames quickly, leaving behind the acrid stench of smoke and a smoldering metal skeleton. Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching Mrs. Henderson sputter excuses to the police officer taking her statement. The old woman's face, usually pinched and sour, was now a mask of feigned innocence. I went to bed early, officer. Must have been some hooligans. The neighborhood's full of them lately, Mrs. Henderson insisted, her voice trembling with what Karen suspected was forced frailty. Officer Davis, a young man with a nervous air, glanced at Karen, his eyes wide with a mixture of sympathy and barely concealed fascination. Karen just raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge in her gaze. She'd deal with Mrs. Henderson later. Right now, she had to play the role of concerned citizen, not vengeful off-duty trooper. The fire crew left, the engine's rumble fading into the night. Officer Davis approached Karen, his expression a mix of concern and apprehension. Awful business, ma'am. Did you happen to see anyone suspicious hanging around? Karen met his gaze, allowing a hint of her simmering fury to flicker across her face. I have my suspicions, officer, but I wouldn't want to point fingers without evidence. Maybe you should ask Mrs. Henderson about the strongly worded letter I received from the HOA yesterday, the one she signed herself. It concerned the presence of my unsightly motorcycle. Davis's eyebrows shot up. He glanced back at Mrs. Henderson, who was now scurrying back into her house, her shoulders hunched as if against a cold wind. He scribbled something in his notepad, a thoughtful frown on his face. Well, ma'am, I'll look into it, he finally said, but the uncertainty in his voice was evident. This small town ran on whispers and favors, and Karen knew Mrs. Henderson had a lot of both at her disposal. As Officer Davis drove away, Karen's phone vibrated in her pocket. It was Sergeant Miller calling back. Karen? You catch the scumbags who did this? He boomed through the phone. Karen smiled grimly. Not yet, Sarge, but I have a feeling this is just the beginning. The game was on. The next morning, Karen woke with a throbbing headache and a steely resolve. She brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to fuel a small army, then sat down at her kitchen table with her laptop and a notepad. The police would be slow-walking the investigation. She knew that much. Small towns like this ran on gossip and favors, and Mrs. Henderson had been greasing palms with her homemade apple pies and meticulously maintained flower beds for years. Karen, however, had her own methods. She started by accessing the HOA's online forum, a cesspool of passive-aggressive complaints and thinly veiled insults disguised as community updates. Sure enough, there it was, a thread titled "Eyesore on Elm Street," filled with comments about Karen's intimidating motorcycle. Mrs. Henderson's username, Gardenialover, popped up under several comments, each one a venomous barb aimed at Karen and her beloved Harley. Next, Karen dug into Mrs. Henderson's past. A few discreet searches revealed the old woman had a history of filing complaints against her neighbors. Noise complaints, property line disputes, even a lawsuit over a barking dog. Mrs. Henderson was a professional victim, and Karen suspected this whole concerned citizen act was just her way of getting rid of someone she didn't like. Armed with this information, Karen decided to pay her dear neighbor a visit. She donned a pair of sunglasses, hiding the steely glint in her eyes, and strolled across the street, her steps confident and purposeful. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted from Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, a calculated attempt at normalcy that only fueled Karen's anger. She rang the doorbell, and a moment later, Mrs. Henderson's face appeared in the doorway, a mask of polite surprise plastered on her wrinkled features. "Karen, what a pleasant surprise. Can I offer you some of my freshly baked cranberry bread?" Karen smiled tightly, a predator sizing up its prey. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, I'm not here for bread. I'm here to talk about my motorcycle." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up in feigned innocence. "Your motorcycle, dear? Whatever do you mean?" Karen stepped inside, uninvited, and placed her phone on the table beside a plate of cooling bread. The screen displayed a screenshot of the "Eyesore on Elm Street" thread, with Mrs. Henderson's inflammatory comments highlighted. "I think you know exactly what I mean," Karen said, her voice low and dangerous. The color drained from Mrs. Henderson's face, leaving behind a sickly shade of beige. She stammered, I don't know what you're talking about. That forum is just for neighborhood concerns." Karen leaned closer, her gaze unwavering. "Burning down someone's property isn't a neighborhood concern, Mrs. Henderson. It's arson. A felony." The old woman flinched, but her facade was cracking. "You can't prove anything," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Oh, I think I can," Karen countered, pulling a small flash drive from her pocket. "I have security footage from a neighbor's camera. It shows a figure, suspiciously like yours, lurking around my driveway last night." This was a bluff, a calculated risk, but Karen was banking on Mrs. Henderson's guilty conscience. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then Mrs. Henderson's shoulders slumped, defeat etched on her face. "All right," she breathed, her voice a whisper. "I admit it. I didn't burn it. Not exactly. But I might have mentioned to some of the boys down at the bar that your bike would make a lovely bonfire." Karen's jaw clenched. So, it wasn't Mrs. Henderson herself, but she had orchestrated the whole thing. This revelation, while infuriating, wasn't surprising. "The boys down at the bar, huh?" Karen repeated, a dangerous edge to her voice. "I think it's time we paid those boys a little visit." The boys in question frequented a dingy establishment on the outskirts of town known as the Watering Hole. It was the kind of place that smelled of stale beer and broken dreams, populated by men who nursed grudges and cheaped whiskey with equal fervor. Karen knew the type. She'd dealt with their kind before. She decided against calling for backup. This wasn't an official police matter, not yet. This was personal. Besides, something told her these guys wouldn't respond well to a uniformed officer. But a lone woman walking into their den, that might just get their attention. The bar was dimly lit, filled with the murmur of hushed conversations and Johnny Cash on the jukebox. Karen, in jeans and a leather jacket, scanned the room, her gaze settling on a group of men huddled in a corner booth. They were all sporting greasy hair, faded band t-shirts, and the kind of shifty eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. One of them, a hulking brute with a neck thicker than a tree trunk, was regaling the others with a story, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Karen recognized him. Bobby the Hammer Henderson. No relation to the old bat, but cut from the same cloth, entitled, vindictive, and with a well-documented history of petty vandalism. He'd been on the wrong side of the law more times than Karen cared to count, but always managed to weasel his way out of any serious charges. As Karen approached their booth, the laughter died down. The men stared at her, their eyes narrowed. The Hammer, his face flushed with alcohol and a sense of self-importance, took a swig of his beer and slurred. Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in. Little Miss HOA herself. What brings you to our humble abode? Karen met his gaze, unflinching. I'm here about my motorcycle, Bobby, she said, her voice calm but firm, each word carrying the weight of an unspoken threat. She leaned closer, letting a flicker of steel glint in her eyes. The one you decided to turn into a bonfire. A hush fell over the booth. Bobby's face, a moment ago flushed with bravado, paled slightly. He glanced nervously at his companions, who suddenly seemed far less amused by the situation. Motorcycle? I don't know what you're talking about, lady, Bobby mumbled, averting his eyes. The stench of stale beer and fear wafted from him. Karen leaned in, placing her hands on the table, forcing him to meet her gaze. Don't play dumb with me, Bobby, she growled, her voice low and dangerous. I know you torched my bike, and I know Mrs. Henderson put you up to it. The mention of Mrs. Henderson's name seemed to galvanize Bobby. He straightened up, a flicker of defiance returning to his eyes. That old bat. She don't tell me what to do, he blustered, his voice regaining some of its former bravado. We did her a favor is all. Taught you a little lesson about respecting your elders. Karen's jaw clenched. She'd hoped to avoid this, but clearly, these imbeciles wouldn't listen to reason. It was time to change tactics. She straightened up, a cold smile playing on her lips. A lesson. Hot, she said, her voice deceptively soft. Well, I'm about to teach you lot a lesson you won't soon forget. She reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers closing around her phone. But it wasn't a call she was making. It was a picture. She slid the phone across the table, the screen facing up. On it was a photograph of Bobby, passed out drunk on his front lawn, his pants around his ankles, a half-eaten burrito smeared across his chest. Recognize this, Bobby? Karen asked, her voice like ice. It's one of many. And let's just say, the local police have a particular interest in these photos. Especially the ones with you vandalizing public property. Bobby stared at the photo, his face turning a delightful shade of crimson. The bravado he tried so hard to maintain crumbled like a stale cookie. He sputtered, trying to form words, but nothing came out but a strangled gasp. His buddies, once so eager to laugh along, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding Karen's gaze. You see, Bobby, Karen continued, her voice a low purr, I have a knack for remembering faces, and names, and let's just say certain indiscretions. She let the word hang in the air, heavy with unspoken consequences. She slid another photo across the table. This one showed Bobby and his cronies spray painting obscenities on the side of the town's Little League dugout. A third photo depicted them tipping over porta potties during the annual fall festival. With each picture, Bobby shrunk further into his seat, his initial defiance replaced by a growing sense of dread. Now I could easily share these little gems with the proper authorities, Karen said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Or, she paused, letting the tension build. We could forget this whole unpleasantness ever happened. The men at the table held their breath, hanging onto her every word. Bobby, his face now ashen, stammered, what do you want? Karen smiled, a slow, predatory grin that sent chills down their spines. I want my bike, Bobby, she said, her voice deceptively sweet. Or, more accurately, I want a brand new Harley, identical to the one you so kindly incinerated. And I want it parked in my driveway by tomorrow morning. She stood up, her gaze sweeping over the group. I think we understand each other, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. As she turned to leave, she added, with a chillingly casual air, oh, and gentlemen, if I were you, I'd steer clear of open flames for the foreseeable future. You wouldn't want to have another accident, would you? Relevant past chat message. The next morning, Karen sipped her coffee, the aroma strangely comforting amidst the lingering scent of ash that clung to her porch. Her gaze drifted towards the curb where her beloved Harley had once been parked. A wave of sadness washed over her, quickly replaced by a steely resolve. They might have taken her bike, but they wouldn't take her peace. As if on cue, a rumble broke the morning silence. A sleek, brand-new Harley, gleaming under the morning sun, rolled to a stop in her driveway. It was identical to her old bike, down to the custom detailing on the gas tank. Leaning against the handlebars, looking sheepish but incredibly relieved, was Bobby the Hammer Henderson. He climbed off the bike and approached Karen, holding out a set of keys with a trembling hand. Here's the bike, like you asked, he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Karen took the keys, a slow smile spreading across her face. Good boy, Bobby, she said, her voice laced with amusement. See? Wasn't so hard, was it? She ran a hand along the bike's leather seat, her fingers lingering on the embossed initials. KT, a wave of satisfaction washed over her. This wasn't just a motorcycle, it was a symbol. A symbol that you couldn't intimidate Karen Thompson, not with petty HOA complaints, and certainly not with arson. As Bobby shuffled back towards his beat-up pickup truck, Karen called out, "Oh, and Bobby." He stopped, his shoulders tensing. Tell your friends at the watering hole I'm taking applications for my fan club. Monthly dues include lawn mowing and home-baked goods. Seems like Mrs. Henderson could use a little help around the house these days. Bobby's eyes widened, then a slow grin spread across his face. He shot Karen a thumbs up. You got it, ma'am. Consider it done. He hopped into his truck and roared off, leaving Karen standing in her driveway, a sense of peace settling over her. Life in the suburbs might not have been what Karen expected, but one thing was for sure, she wasn't just another bored housewife. She was Karen Thompson, and she always got her due. And sometimes, justice arrived with a roar of an engine and a brand new coat of paint.